Okay, I'd like to introduce the person who's going to do the introduction because he's been a real great supporter of this conference and event and has been a stalwart here. This is Dean Florenz Plossman, who joined Ohio University as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences just past July. Prior to that, he spent 20 years at Binghamton University, one of SUNY's 4 research universities. There he was an associate dean and department chair of economics. He also is the director of the doctoral program in philosophy. If you've read David McAuliffe's book, you may have met the polymath character, Sam Hildreth, the doctor who does all sorts of things. I think Dean Plossman is sort of a 21st century version of a polymath who, after all your time at this conference, you're probably going to be ready to start writing history books just like Hildreth did as well. So he is welcome to the stage. Thank you for your support. Thank your office for your support in helping us pull this conference off.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for this very, very nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm very much looking forward to the second day of the conference. I was fortunate to be able to attend several of the sessions yesterday. They were really, really great. This is the point where usually the speaker gives thanks to everybody, but Dr. Shane and President Nallis said it so eloquently yesterday, so I just say what they said, and I'm expressing my thanks to everybody whom they thanked yesterday. It's my great pleasure to introduce this morning's first speaker, Dr. Bill Carrigan. He is the Cole Distinguished Professor of American History at Muskingum University. He teaches a broad range of courses in American history. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Michigan. He's an expert on antebellum America and on John Appleseed Chapman. He has several publications on local history, and he's the author of the book Johnny Appleseed and the American Orchard, A Cultural History, that was published by Johns Hopkins Press in 2012, and which is for sale outside. Hint, hint. I know you're here to listen to Dr. Kerrigan, but allow me to sort of say two things while I'm particularly looking forward to your talk. The first one is that I know that Johnny Appleseed is an American icon, and everybody in the US knows about him. Not so much outside the US. I grew up in Germany, and I had actually only once heard of Johnny Appleseed before coming to the US in 1991, and that was when I read Robert Heinlein's book, Farmer in the Sky, as a teenager. There's sort of one reference to a character, Johnny Appleseed. And I remember I was puzzled. I was sort of supposed to know what this is and what he represented. But that was the days before Wikipedia, and I couldn't just look it up that easily. When I came to the US, my first station in 1990 was Blacksburg, Virginia. And I learned that there's a tree that was supposedly grafted from one of the authentic trees that Appleseed had planted. And then, of course, when I came to OU this summer, or the past summer, I visited Athens Appleseed Park, which was another interesting connection to Johnny Appleseed. So I'm looking forward to learning much more about him. The second reason why I'm looking forward to your talk is because I went to Amazon.com to look at reviews of your book. And of course, we tell students, never do research on Amazon.com or Wikipedia. That is bad. But it's such a wonderful start for research. So I took this as a starting point. And I came across one review of your book that was sort of insightful, because the reviewer compared your book with a book published in 1954 by Robert Price. And the reviewer wrote the following: Price's book is the one that one needs to read to glean every available factual detail about Chapman and form a coherent idea about Johnny Appleseed, the man and what he did. Now, Kerrigan's book is the one that one needs to read to comprehend the man and why he did it. And I admit, I'm almost always more interested in the why than in the what. So I think you probably look at it exactly from the kind of point of view that I will find fascinating. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and I'll present to you Dr. Kerrigan. who will give us a presentation on Johnny Appleseed, apple cultures, and the settlements in the Old Northwest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and I'm going to repeat what other speakers have said. Thank you so much, Brian and Tim, for putting together this amazing conference, which is happening in the right place at the right time. And in every presentation I heard yesterday, I learned something new. And to the extent that I went back last night and changed some things in my presentation. So I'm going to jump around my slides a little bit, in part to respond and add to and build on what other scholars have said. And so I will, I'm going to set a timer on myself since I am going a little rogue and make sure I don't go too long. So, okay. Okay, so the first thing I want to do to get off the table is a common idea that Johnny Appleseed was the first person to bring apples to Ohio, okay? And when I started doing research on Johnny Appleseed many, many years ago and visited a lot of local history sites, a lot of county historical societies, many, many people told me, well, Johnny Appleseed planted the first trees in our town or our county. And I would ask them, how do you know that? And they said, well, when the first white farmers arrived, there were apple trees here, so Johnny Appleseed must have planted them. So Johnny Appleseed's kind of like Santa Claus. He's been everywhere, right? Okay, he's kind of a cross between St. Francis and Santa Claus. And he has some superpowers, and some people even claim trees in California were planted by Johnny Appleseed. But the truth about apples and apple propagation is that the apple comes from Kazakhstan. It comes from Central Asia, near the city of Almaty, which means the city of apples. Okay? And the apple has been carried by all sorts of different cultures and peoples around the globe. Okay? So people brought it from Central Asia east into China. Okay? And others brought it west into West Asia, and then into Turkey, and then into North Africa, and then into Europe. Okay? And when Europeans began to colonize in the Americas, many of them also brought apples here. And the assumption was that the propagation of apples in America was always done by the Europeans. But no, another peoples found them useful and valuable and also spread them. So the first apples that were brought into Ohio were brought by Indian peoples, by Native Americans. So the Wendat got them from the Jesuits and brought them into Michigan and Ohio. And by the time Anthony Wayne was invading Northwest Ohio for the Battle of Fallen Timber, there were large Indian orchards along the Maumee River. The Lenape Indians acquired them from the new Swedish colony, and which was a kind of there were Swedes and Finns and Frenchmen and Dutchmen all in this little Delaware Valley colony. And the Lenape adopted apples from them, carried them across Pennsylvania and into eastern Ohio. And there were probably other introductions as well. So John Chapman was not the first to bring apples to Ohio, but he is still, in my mind, very significant, and we'll talk about why. It's significant for understanding Ohio culture in its early years. I want to also say a few things. If I get the slide to switch, do I aim this anywhere in particular? There, okay. About why this is such a great place to have this conference, because the Department of Geography at Ohio University has long been a leader in producing the kind of research, and continues to be a leader in producing the kind of research that geographers and historians depend upon to tell the story of Ohio. And when I started my early investigation of John Chapman, I came across the work of Dr. Hubert Wilhelm, who I never met, but he was in the Department of Geography here. And he did a lot of the early important work on mapping out settlement in Ohio. And this is one of his maps from one of his publications. And you also, I think it's important to say, and Tim has advanced that work, and you will see better maps that he showed yesterday that build on this work. This department still continues to be so important in providing that geographical knowledge that both geographers and historians need. And so this is exactly where this conference should be. And I want everyone to understand how significant this geography department is. So this map by Wilhelm kind of talks a little bit, in a little bit more simplistic terms about what Tim talked about yesterday, different culture groups that come across Ohio. And you find as a generalization, in the north, you're going to get mostly Yankee settlement. I used to use a term Yankee Yorker, that some of these people had been from New England, perhaps they had spent a generation in upstate New York, and mostly migrated across the northern part of the state, a big exception being Marietta and Athens, right? You get a mid-Atlantic culture of Germans and Scots-Irish, okay? And in the southern part of the state, the dominant culture is often upland southern culture. And so even as we look at and we think about Marietta and Athens and the things in Bill McCullough's book, David McCullough's book, we want to keep in mind these other cultures that Tim talked about yesterday and that Annalisa talked about last night. Here's another map from Hubert Wilhelm's book, the first attempt to sort of map the distribution of African Americans in 1850, and then Annalisa Cox's great map that she showed yesterday builds on this and gives us a lot more information. But that's a little bit of the history of scholarship on Ohio settlement that I think everybody should be aware of and recognize as important. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit now about these, about the varied peoples that come into Ohio and where John Chapman fits in that story. Okay. You know, Dave McCullough brought a lot of attention to a moment in Ohio history with his recent book, and that was a good thing. But as we heard yesterday from a lot of scholars, that he told a very narrow story. He told a very small part of that story. You know, even the conference title, settlement or settling, we've problematized, right? So we know that settlement happened way before the first European arrived in this place we call Ohio, right? We heard some great presentations on Native American history in Ohio way before the arrival of the pioneers at Marietta. We also heard about Germans and other regional cultures coming in, and upland Southerners coming in from Virginia, and those differences as well. We even heard about some political differences in Joseph's paper about Republicans and Federalists. And then we heard a great talk by Annalisa Cox last night about African Americans who'd been kind of forgotten, African American farmers and their role. And it's important to be inclusive, not just for the sake of inclusiveness. To understand Ohio's history, you can't just look at one group. Okay? And one of the things that I was left with when I finished David McCullough's book was, boy, these Mariettians were remarkable people. They were smart. They planned this colony very well. They had extraordinary resources. What happened? Because Marietta became eclipsed by other parts of the state. And David McCullough's book can't answer that question because he only looks at kind of upper class white New Englanders. And if you want to understand what happened, you have to broaden the frame. You have to understand the upland Southerners who come to overwhelm Washington County and make New Englanders a minority within that county. You have to understand the Germans. You have to understand the Scots-Irish. You have to understand the African Americans. You have to look at the native peoples not just as shadowy others, scary shadowy others on the periphery, but as part of the story, right? And that is how you get to, and you have to even talk more about politics, as Joseph did. We need to talk about the Republicans and the Federalists and those different political fights. You have to get to all of that to really explain how Ohio develops in this time. Now, I'm going to add a new layer to that by talking about what I'll call class. Now, it might be problematic in terms of how we define class, but we could also talk about wealth and the power that comes with wealth, because John Chapman represented in his behavior and his activities a certain class of Ohioans, and his clientele were a certain class. So I want to talk about them in the context of some other Ohioans who are also planting apples. I'm going to grab some water real quick. So we have a picture here of Rufus Putnam, Marietta founder, and Thomas Worthington, a Virginian, 6th governor of Ohio, who settled in the Chillicothe region, it's the state Adena, and they were both also apple growers. But they were very different kinds of apple growers than John Chapman. Take another look at a picture of John Chapman, okay. This picture of John Chapman on the left is probably the best representation we have of John Chapman. It was drawn by an Oberlin College student who drew it from a description given to her by a woman named Rosella Rice. And Rosella Rice was a writer. She wrote for women's magazines and children's magazines, and she wrote a few novels in the late 19th century. And she had, when she was a child, John Chapman used to visit her family farm. And so she saw him as a child looking up at this kindly and strange and oddly eccentric man who came to visit her farm. And it was based on that description that this sketch was drawn. So that's probably the best we're going to get in terms of representation of who he was. Now, he's pretty disheveled looking. He's barefoot. His pants are all torn and ragged at the end. His shirt is ill-fitting. His suspenders are kind of barely holding up his pants. He is he's quite different in the way he looks than these other two gentlemen we saw just a second ago. If I move back. Rufus Putnam and Thomas Worthington, who were men of great standing, men who had high status, and men who had significant wealth. Okay. Now, John Chapman is famous for planting apple trees, apple seeds, and growing apple trees, but he pursued this in a very different way than the Rufus Putnams and the Thomas Worthington. So in David McCullough's book, David McCullough says that Rufus Putnam brought the seeds from 50 different apple varieties to Marietta, and that's an error because there is no variety in an apple seed. And an apple seed contains all the genetic diversity of those original apples from Kazakhstan. Okay? And when you plant an apple seed, the apple that is produced by the tree that grows from there is not likely to have many similarities with the apple it came from. So if you love your Honeycrisp and you say, gosh, I want a Honeycrisp tree, and you save those seeds and you plant them in your backyard and you wait and wait until they grow into a tree, when those first fruit appear, you're going to be super disappointed. They're not going to be anything like Honeycrisps. So Rufus Putnam didn't bring, he may have brought seeds, but I think what he brought were young grafted trees. The way you propagate a specific variety of apples is through grafting. Okay? You should think about every Honeycrisp apple tree as a clone of the original Honeycrisp apple tree. Okay? You do not propagate them, at least consistently, with seeds. If you plant from seeds, you're kind of throwing in a genetic lottery. And now every once in a while, you plant a whole lot of seeds, you're going to, by surprise, by luck of draw, some are going to develop amazing apples, and maybe that's a new variety that will then be propagated. So I'm going to jump forward some slides and show you some pictures of wild apples and Roxbury Russets, so you can understand this a little bit. So John Chapman planted apple trees from seed, and if nothing was done to those trees, if no later grafting occurred to that tree, then those trees would most likely produce apples like that, kind of gnarled, maybe very bitter, not something you would want to bite into, could be very, very tart. Okay? Now, one of the favorite varieties of the Putnams in Marietta was the Roxbury Russet. It's one of the oldest cultivars in America, and it had particular value at that time. It was known as what's called a winter apple. Another way to put it is it's a good keeping apple. The Roxbury Russet, you could fill a barrel full of Roxbury Russets, and you could put those barrels on a flatboat, and you could float them all the way down to New Orleans, and they were still good apples. And you could probably put them on a ship and take them all the way back to the East Coast, because before you had good roads and good transportation, that was actually the easiest way to move farm goods. So the value of the Roxbury Russet, well, it's a pretty good tasting apple, but it also had this great value for its longevity. Okay. Winter apples also had value because you would put away your winter apples till January or February, store them in a cellar when there were no more fresh apples out, and suddenly the price of apples was a little higher, and you could pull out your winter apples and sell them for a little bit more. So from the outset at Marietta, there was an interest in grafted trees, trees that had specific names, that had specific brands. When people bought those trees, they knew exactly what they were buying. They knew the qualities of that apple. They knew whether it was a good baking apple, or a good fresh eating apple, or a good cider apple. Okay. It had commercial value. Wild apples did not have commercial value, but they had a lot of value nonetheless, particularly for the poor. So think about what it would have taken in the 1780s to get grafted trees to Marietta. You would have relatively small trees, but these are trees where you've taken the rootstock of one tree and you've literally cut it in half, and then you've bound it together and it's formed a new tree, and everything that grows above that graft is going to have that specific variety. You have to get these fragile trees all the way to Ohio. You have to keep them moist, and they can't get crushed. You have to have a lot of space in your luggage. Okay? And only rich people had a lot of space in their luggage. Okay? So the Putnams could afford to bring grafted trees. A lot of poor settlers could not afford to bring grafted trees. Okay? But when they got here, they needed apple orchards as quickly as possible. Okay? John Chapman's idea, the thing that made him a person in demand, was to go to eastern cider mills, scoop up all the discarded pumice after you've pressed the apples with the seeds in it, carry those to Ohio, plant them in shabby nurseries around the state in strategic locations where he anticipated settlers would be coming in, and then as settlers came in 2 to 3 years later, he could sell those settlers 2 to 3 year old seedlings. That's a 2 to 3 year head start on an apple orchard. Now, it's a 2 to 3 year head start on a wild apple orchard. Okay? But wild apple orchards had a lot of value for poor settlers who were mostly focused on feeding themselves. So you would find that you could press them into cider. Wild apples will make very good cider. Okay? You could also make cider vinegar with them. If you had an apple orchard of 100 wild apples, just by luck of the draw, one of those was going to produce good fresh eating apples. And a standard apple tree, which is much, much larger than the ones that you'll see at your U-Pick orchard, a standard apple tree, as it matured, could produce more apples than one family could possibly consume in a year. So your wild apple orchard did everything you needed. It provided you with fresh apples. It provided you with the raw ingredients for cider, and it could be converted to pork. Let those apples fall on the ground, send the hogs in there, fatten the hogs in them before you slaughter them. These had lots of value for subsistence farmers. They had almost no value for a commercial market farmer. So to understand Johnny Appleseed, you need to understand his audience is the poor subsistence farmer. And he's called Johnny Appleseed, not Johnny Appletree. And that's a distinction that people would have understood at the time. He is growing wild apples. And most of the time, as he travels around the state, he is going to be planting in areas where he can, where people need his apples. So let's go back and talk about some other apple cultures. I want to flip back a few slides. Hopefully. Oh, all the way back to the beginning. I'll try again. Okay, we're going to get there. Let's go back to Worthington and Putnam. Okay, so Rufus Putnam and Israel Putnam, another Putnam who quickly had in Marietta by 1794. He had brought back, he had planted a lot of seedling trees, and then he brought back in 1794, Israel Putnam brought back saddlebags full of grafts from grafted varieties, where he had dipped the grafts into beeswax and carefully brought them back, and then grafted them onto wild trees that were a couple years old, and so then he now had grafted varieties. He, within a short period of time, had apples available in Marietta that could be sold to people that wanted grafted varieties. And he could also sell the fruit commercially. So the apple culture of Marietta was very quickly a commercial apple culture. Thomas Worthington, who settled, built his big estate in Edina in the Virginia Military District, brought with him, he had a lot of money, he brought with him several wagons. He brought 2 big pier glass windows, mirrors with him. He had a lot of laborers. He brought with him a very large stock of grafted trees that had to be carefully wrapped and kept moist as he floated them down the Ohio River and up into the Chillicothe region. And he built a fine estate, and he laid out an orchard of the finest varieties of apples. And some of those he probably shared with William Henry Harrison, who did the same at Grouseland. Okay. Harrison and Worthington and men like them saw apples as a way to assert their status. They modeled their lives on the lives of Washington and Jefferson and Madison, those founders who all had fine orchards. And you wanted a fine orchard so that when guests came to visit you at dinner, after dinner for desserts, you could provide them with some very fine, fresh fruit. Okay. And so apple growing was a way to show your wealth for Worthington. And so in the Virginia Military District, you had very quickly a lot of large orchards with lots of varieties. And for the Putnams, it was a way to advance your portfolio of how you could make money. It was another good that you could make money on. So grafted trees were important as well. So I want to talk about John Chapman and his connections to Ohio at this time, and say a few things about where he ended up spending most of his time, and where he planted his apples and where he didn't. So John was born poor. His father, Nathaniel Chapman, was orphaned at 14. An uncle had him apprenticed to a carpenter. He married a woman in Leominster, Massachusetts, whose family had a little bit of land. So he had a small farm, not large enough to make a living off of, but he could supplement it with his carpenter work. When Lexington and Concord, when the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened, he was a Minuteman. He went off to fight in the Revolution, leaving behind a young son who had just been born in 1774 and a young daughter who had been born 2 years before that, and his wife. And Nathaniel Chapman was what historian John Shai called a hardcore patriot. Now, if you look at who fought in the Revolution, you had in New England, the majority of adult white men of military age served, but they typically served for 1, maybe 2 seasons. Okay? You put in your card, you did your service, and then you maybe found a job in your town. You were in charge of gathering supplies for the armies, you were in charge of recruiting new soldiers, and you were at home and you were taking care of your farm or your business, and it wasn't going to pot. The hardcores were the people, John Shai said, that fought for 4, 5, 6 or more years. And he looked at this group and he discovered that who's overrepresented among the hardcores? The very poor, okay? And the marginal. African Americans are overrepresented in the hardcore group. New immigrants are overrepresented in the hardcore group, and the very poor are overrepresented. And Nathaniel Chapman was a hardcore, and he fought for about 5 seasons, and then he was stationed at, he lost his wife during the war while he was helping build the fences of New York. His wife, who had contracted tuberculosis and was pregnant, gave birth to a baby, and both mother and child died within 2 weeks of the childbirth. And so John was raised, young John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, was raised by local relatives. His father, Nathaniel, when he left the service, 1780, 1781, he was stationed at the Springfield Armory. He met a local girl named Lucy Cooley. Lucy Cooley, his family had a little bit of land. He got a small farm with that marriage. And John and his sister eventually joined that family. Lucy would go on to have 10 children in a very small house. And after the war, Nathaniel was still pretty poor. He had lost that original property during the war. He had gained through marriage a second small property, but when the state of Massachusetts decided to raise taxes, property taxes, to pay off debt that was held almost exclusively by wealthy speculators, Nathaniel Chapman's small farm was taxed to the point where he couldn't pay the taxes, and he was forced to sell his property and become a tenant on his own farm. And so twice he lost farms in the Revolution. In 1788, tenant Nathaniel Chapman and his son John, who was then about 14, would have been in Longmeadow when one of the Ohio Company wagon trains came through on their way down to Marietta. And you can imagine, wow, they might have wanted to join them, but they couldn't afford to. You still needed resources to go west. You needed financial resources, and you also needed some labor. And at that time, John was 13 or 14. His younger siblings were all too young to help with that. So they could not go on to Marietta. Now, a few years later, after Native American groups attacked settlers who'd pushed north of Marietta and had been settling at Big Bottom, Marietta came up with a plan to try to deal with what was deemed the Indian threat. And they offered land north of Marietta, a strip of land called the Donation Tract, to poor men who, actually the description was they wanted warlike Christian men, warlike Christian men who would come to this buffer of land. They would build a cabin, they would clear a certain number of acres of land, and they would plant at least 20 peach trees and 50 apple trees. And so they were going to be set. Oh, they had to also, according to the requirements, they had to have guns and they had to have ammunition. And they were going to be the front line of a Native American attack. They were going to protect Marietta. These were poor men who were going to be offered this opportunity to be the ones who got killed if things got worse with Native Americans. So Chapman's cousins, the Cooleys, his stepmother's family, four boys from the Cooley family moved out to Marietta to go to the Donation Tract. And they had gotten themselves quite established. By 1797, Native American resistance in Ohio had been crushed at the Battle of Falling Timbers. There was less of a threat. So those requirements on Donation Tract holders were kind of released. The Cooleys did pretty well locally. They bought some additional land. And then sometime around in 1804, 1805, in that winter, Nathaniel Chapman, Lucy Cooley, and their remaining kids back in Longmeadow, with the help of John Appleseed Chapman and two of the oldest boys, Nathaniel and Parley, moved to the Marietta area. okay? I think the family was in desperate straits. Nathaniel Sr. was ill, and he would die a year or two after they came to Marietta. They did not get a property title to any property. They settled somewhere along the Duck Creek, which, if you visit Marietta and you go up the Duck Creek, it's a kind of a narrow, flood-prone area. It's not the most desirable land to farm there. The exact location of where the Chapmans settled was, we don't know for sure. It may have been the Cooley's cousins allowed them to settle on one of their donation tract lands, or they may have just squatted on land that no one else wanted. Many of the Chapmans stayed there for the rest of their lives, and John visited his half-brothers and half-sisters quite frequently, but he did not spend much of his time in terms of planting apple trees in Marietta. And the reason he didn't is because by that time, people had easy access to grafted trees. So he went to other areas to do to sell his trees. And I want to show you a map and talk a little bit about the places where John Chapman spent his life with his trees. I'm going to, in the interest of time, just skip this, except to say that the first place John Chapman went before he came to Ohio is he spent time in northwestern Pennsylvania, and that's kind of where he developed his Appleseed plan. Apologies, the slides are delayed. I'm going to try to back up again. Oh, we're back to the beginning. There's some apples right there. You can find this map. Okay, so John, the first place he went was to eastern Ohio, to the region we know as the Seven Ranges. And you saw some maps of the Seven Ranges earlier. So those very hilly counties that are also not necessarily the most desirable land on the eastern boundary of Ohio. And when he started planting seedling trees around there, the eastern Ohio was still a very poor place. One family, the Williams family, who were present at the time John Chapman was planting trees, described their situation this way. They said the Williams family was a widowed mother who had 3 children. John Williams, who wrote this memoir, was 11 at the time he arrived. He said, we were weak-handed and weak-pocketed. And we had no money, and we had only our own labor to eke a living out in eastern Ohio. Okay? So they planted turnips, and they subsisted on turnips and walnuts that they collected in the forest, and they planted peach stones, because peach stones will grow a little bit truer to the peach than an apple seed does to the apple, and peaches grow quickly, so you can start to get peaches in 2 or 3 years maybe if you've got the right weather. Okay, so we got it sort of working again? All right. We're doing it on the computer. Okay, so yes, here's the, so you're going to just do it from there. Okay, great. So 7 ranges you can see on the east side. Now, first I have to also tell you, the geographers in the room are just about freaking out because there's an error on this map. But this is because as I loaded this, I loaded the draft map that the map maker made for my book. If you want the accurate map, you can get it in the book when you buy it outside. The error in the map is that the Greenville Treaty Line actually goes due north when it meets the Tuscarawas River along the Portage Path and then up to the Cuyahoga River. It doesn't go all the way across the state, so apologies for that. Accurate map in the book. This was the draft map. So the 7 Ranges area where the Williams family came from was a place where for a few years it was very touch and go, and there were a lot of very poor families that would have needed John Chapman's apples. Okay? And he did begin to plant apples there, but he left after a year or two, and the reason he probably left was because on Wheeling Island, just across from Wheeling, Ebenezer Zane had planted large orchards that were now maturing of grafted trees. And in Wellsboro, what was then Wellsboro, Virginia, and is now Wellsboro, West Virginia, Jacob Nestle had planted 50 to 100 acres of trees. And so he knew that in eastern Ohio, that this place was connected enough to good stock that there wasn't going to be a long-term market for his seedling trees. So the next place he went to, and maybe you could push the next slide. Okay. The next place he went to was really, he started going up the upper Muskingum watershed. And he went to the Licking Valley there. And in the Licking Valley, there are actually two narratives about John Chapman's presence there. There are about 12 Licking County families who have family stories that the apples that they grew on their family farms came from Johnny Appleseed. Okay. Well, in 1863, many years after, about 20 years after John Chapman died, a county history said nearly all the apples in Licking County were from Johnny's trees. And there was a local woman who was very angry to hear that. Her name was Catherine Stadden. And Catherine and her husband, Isaac, had come from central Pennsylvania. They were among the earliest settlers in the Licking Valley. And they had brought with them, carefully, she had packed, they were not rich people, but they had some resources. She had carefully cut away suckers, those root spouts that come off of trees, of her favorite apple tree. And she packed them in her chest, and she kept them moist, and she planted them in her yard, and they grew up. And when she would go to membership meetings of the Licking County Pioneer and Historical Society, she would bring apples from that tree for everybody to enjoy. And she did not think highly of John Chapman. She did not think he was a worthy person to be associated with. The county history not only said did he plant all the apples, but claimed her husband Isaac had been his partner. And she wrote an angry letter saying, my husband would never have affiliated with that guy. His apples were useless. They were wild, and they were gnarled, and they're bitter, and he just planted these nurseries randomly in the wilderness, and most of them just got browsed by deer or cow, and nothing came of them, right? She said, my husband did have a partner. My husband had a partner, but his name was Johnny Goldthwait. And Johnny Goldthwait and my husband, we planted respectable grafted trees. Okay. So I was curious about this, and I thought, well, was there really a Johnny Goldthwait? I started researching that, and in fact, I found Johnny Goldthwait, and weirdly enough, Johnny Goldthwait was also from Longmeadow, Massachusetts, where the Chapmans had been living. He was a school teacher and a preacher, and he'd come to Marietta, and then he moved up into the Licking Valley. And then after he had partnered with Isaac Stadden, he moved a little bit south to the Fairfield, Lancaster area, and he started an orchard there he was very proud of that had all these varieties. And there's a story about Johnny Goldthwait that Johnny Goldthwait as a New Englander, as a Yankee, he was kind of a member of the Federalist Party. And one day, two Republican lawyers from Lancaster came to visit his orchard, and he showed them his Roxbury Russets and his Westfield Seek No Furthers and an apple he called the Federalist apple. And the Republican lawyers said, well, we've seen your Federalist apple. Where are your Republican ones? Or where are your Democrat ones, I think is the way that they use the term. And Johnny Goldthwait walked to the edge of the orchard where this scrawny little volunteer tree had shown up, and he says, that is a Democrat apple, okay? It's not the only time that I came across references to wild apples as Democrat apples, okay? So there was cultural significance for these kinds of trees. Now, when Goldthwait had gone a little bit south of Zane's Trace, John Chapman started to move north, and he went up to the Mount Vernon area, and he was one of the early settlers in that area. And he probably did meet, if you were here last night, Annalisa Cox talked about Enoch Harris or Enoch Harris, who was one of the founding settlers of Knox and Morrow County. And he was an African-American farmer, and he was one of the first people to buy land in Mount Vernon. And he was a different, he was a different kind of farmer than John Chapman, a different kind of apple grower. He eventually leaves Knox and Morrow County, and he goes up to Kalamazoo, and he plants commercial orchards up there in southwestern Michigan, which becomes a very important apple growing region. So he was very much more like, Enoch Harris was very much more like those Putnam orchardists that you found in Marietta. Enoch was also a smarter businessman than John Chapman. So Enoch bought land in the town of Mount Vernon, a couple of plots. He paid $8 a plot, and a couple of years later, as people moved in, he sold them for $50 a plot. John Chapman bought 2 plots for $50 along the Kokosing River. One of them got wiped away when the river changed course, and the other he sold 20 years later for less than he bought it for. So he was not a good real estate investor. But Nuck and John Chapman probably knew each other. They were in the same place and the same time, but they also were kind of very different types of settlers. Okay, so as John Chapman gets a little older, he doesn't move as much as he did in his earlier days. By 1810, 1820, he's staying in the upper Muskingum watershed area, and that area is changing around him. It's getting connected to the rest of the world through canals and good roads, and then eventually railroads towards the very end of his life in 1845. It's becoming a market-focused area. And John Chapman is still walking around barefoot in ragged handmade clothes and hawking seedling trees that are seen as a relic of the past. He becomes the subject of stories and tall tales. People have kind of fond memories of him, mostly, I think, for nostalgic reasons by that point. They see the world changing. Americans love change and innovation, but they also love to talk about what was lost before that change happened. And Chapman becomes kind of a person who is standing out in this new world in a way he probably wasn't standing out in 1810. There were a lot of rough and rugged people in Ohio in 1810, and there were not so many people like John Chapman in a place like Mansfield by 1840. But we also see that there's evidence that his demand for his seedling trees is disappearing as more and more grafted commercial varieties come about. And so he starts to move his operations into this region in northwestern Ohio, was known as the Black Swamp. And now the Black Swamp has been drained, and so it's very fertile farm land now. It's very valuable farmland. But in the 19th century, it was a big, boggy wetland with hillocks of land that stood up above the water, and it was hard to drive roads through it. It was the last bastion of isolation you would have found in Ohio. John Chapman knew who his customers were. Who would go to the Black Swamp? Those dirt-poor farmers who were living a subsistence life. So in his last years, he moves his operation into the Black Swamp area. And it's in the Black Swamp area that he finds still a customer base. No longer back in Mansfield or way down in Marietta when he would go visit his family, which he did frequently, would people have seen much value in his trees. But in the Black Swamp area, there was still a market for his trees, and that kind of where he ended. He does pass away in 1845, and a lot of the legends about him don't really make it to print until after his death. A lot of people, in speculative ways, try to explain why he would plant trees from seed and then not graft them. A decision that would have been perfectly logical and perfectly rational for a poor family in the 1810s and 20s, but that cultural knowledge gets lost by the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, and beyond. So people have to make up reasons for why he does this. And they say, oh, he believed that God told him that it was a sin to cut an apple tree, you know. I think that's nonsense. I think he had a very good and logical reason to plant seedling trees, and he was providing something that poor Ohioans needed. But later generations forgot the value of those trees. So what can we learn from John Chapman's story? I think what we can learn, and we look at David McCullough's work and we try to figure out Ohio, is it's important that we look at all these different groups of people that made Ohio, right? And each of them bring their own perspectives and their own values. And we need to look at Germans and Scots-Irish and Yankees, and we need to look at African Americans, and we need to look at those who call themselves Federalists and those who call themselves Republicans. And we also need to pay attention to the difference between the poor in Ohio and the Rufus Putnams of the world. One thing I should have said before is in 1810, 20 years after the settlement, 2 decades after the settlement of Marietta, only about half of the adult males in Ohio owned land. So the rural poor were not a trivial amount of people, and that was Chapman's audience. And they are also a group that kind of gets erased from our history when we focus on the Worthingtons and the Putnams, and we don't really quite see those large numbers of people below them. Okay, now I want to just open it up for questions at this time, so fire away.
We do, this is being live streamed and archived, so we would like you to use a microphone for your questions, which we have a few minutes for. So just pop your hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you and you can ask away.
One of the stories that I've heard about Chapman is that if you cultivated land, then you could lay claim to that land. Mm-hmm. Any truth to that, or would he have been selling these places that he had?
In many places, that was a specific way to lay claim. In fact, in northwestern Pennsylvania, where we first went to, Pennsylvania had contradictory laws. You could acquire land 2 ways. You could go into a land office in the east and put money down, or you could go improve land. And there was definitions of improving land. You had to plow a certain number of acres. It often explicitly said you needed to plant a certain number of fruit trees. He actually lost a claim to that. Northwestern Pennsylvania became a landmine of legal fights and sometimes violence, as these people like John Chapman had improved land in northwestern Pennsylvania. He'd planted his trees, as some of his neighbors did. And then agents of wealthy speculators came in and said, we got these pieces of paper from Philadelphia that say we own this land. The donation tract required you plant trees. That was one of the definitions for different parts of Ohio and different parts of Pennsylvania, what improvement meant. So getting land by the right of improvement was a common practice, and it was usually specifically defined in terms of what you had to do to declare that land was improved. Did Chapman ever take advantage of that? Well, the one time he tried to in northwestern Pennsylvania, he got his claim jumped. A rich guy's agent came by and said, I own this land, and he didn't have a lawyer, so he just gave up and walked away. He did try, actually, to speculate in land at one point, too. If I had more time, I'd talk about that. But he eventually kind of abandoned that as well.
Hi. I'm Hubert Wilhelm's son, by the way.
Oh, wow. Wow. You look like him. He's got
I've been told that.
Okay.
I'm proud of that. And I want you to know that I had a hand in the production of that
Did you
map.
really? Oh, awesome.
And after a national search, he hired me to help count the 1850 census. So
Okay.
I'm glad to see that up there.
Okay. Great.
He was a deeply spiritual man.
Yes.
And I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and the extent to which his wanderings might have been informed by his Swedenborgian missionary work.
So,
and also the extent to which hard cider might have played a role in his business strategy?
Okay, so those are two good questions, and I could go on both of them for a really long time, so let me try to distill them. John Chapman was an advocate, a follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish physicist who in midlife was visited by angels who took him to heaven and he wrote books describing heaven. Swedenborgianism was one of dozens and dozens of religious sects in Ohio in these years, a period I call the spiritual cafeteria, where people were being told, there's this choice, there's Quakers and there's Baptists and there's Shakers. And the Swedenborgians, for reasons you buy me a beer, I'll talk from all night, they were not very successful in terms of recruiting. They were very much a head religion at a time where the religions that dominated and got the most converts were heart religions. On the question of hard cider, and Michael Pollan, who's a lovely writer on food, he wrote on Johnny Appleseed in his book Botany of Desire many years ago. And his take on John Chapman was he was this sort of Dionysian corrupting figure. He followed around a man from Cincinnati named Bill Jones, a lawyer who was devoted to the idea of Johnny Appleseed, who financed a short-lived Johnny Appleseed outdoor theater play up near Mansfield, and who had this kind of angelic vision of Johnny Appleseed as representing all good things. And Pollan kind of made fun of, in a not a very fair way, Bill Jones, who was very sincere about promoting the Johnny Appleseed story. And he used Bill Jones as a foil to say, well, Chapman's apples were only good. The only use of a seedling apple was to make hard cider. So he was really the corrupter. He was bringing alcohol to the frontier. And there's a partial truth in that. That was, hard cider was one of the dominant uses of seedling apples. But there were a lot of other uses, as I said. You could make vinegar, you could fatten hogs. You would, in a seedling orchard, likely have a couple of usable trees for other purposes as well. There are also sort of legends of this time of people going around cutting down seedling trees with axes as the temperance movement comes along. A lot of that history gets, in popular history, the temperance movement of the 1820s gets squashed together with the prohibition of the 1920s, and a lot of complicated things that happen across a century get squashed together. So yeah, absolutely the trees made hard cider, which was useful, had bacteria counts. Alcoholic beverages were safer to drink sometimes on the frontier because if they had a high enough alcohol level, it would kill bacteria. But they were a very important use, but they weren't its only use. Yeah.
I think we have time for just one more question here. No. Well, maybe we'll make it two.
All right. I'm just wondering, have you kind of put into practice some of these growing techniques of apples? Do you grow apples? And also, would you say that it's kind of like as cotton was to much of the American South, were apples much of a part of the development of this area and region?
Good questions. Yes, I do grow apples. I'm not the most successful apple grower. I have historic heritage varieties in my yard. I tried growing a Roxbury Russet and it did not thrive. I have an Arkansas Black, which is a southern apple that I love. It's a really hard, dark red apple, but it's a good keeping apple. And I have a Spitzenberg, which was a variety that Thomas Jefferson mentioned. I have not grown a wild tree, but I have a very deep interest in heritage apples. The second question was, apple culture in Ohio is a very important part. I like to think of the agriculture of European agriculture that migrates into Ohio as kind of a three-legged stool. You had annual crops, livestock, and the third leg, which gets ignored a lot, is perennial crops like apples and peaches and things like that. And my mission is to make people pay closer attention to the important role that perennial crops played on these farms. Yeah.
Could you mention a little bit about his relationship with Native Americans during that time?
It's a very good question. So in a lot of the 20th century and post World War II children's books and stories, they talk a lot about how John Chapman, a man of peace, that Native Americans innately saw in him somebody that they were an ally with and that they understood him. When I looked at the real evidence of specific stories, that didn't hold up. His first encounters with Native Americans were in northwestern Pennsylvania, where he was tapping maple trees on corn planters' land, and those Native Americans were trying to chase him away. During the War of 1812, he very clearly allied himself with white settlers, and there was an incident when some Native Americans stole some of his ponies. I think his relationship with Native Americans was pretty much the same relationship most white settlers had. And in our imagination, we think it was always violent, and it wasn't. Very often, whites and Native Americans had a mutual interest in trading with each other and working with each other. And those periods of collaboration and cooperation were interrupted sometimes with brutal violence. So I think that the idea, one of my theories about the legend of Johnny Appleseed is that during the Cold War, he becomes the Cold War liberals' version of American history. Whereas Davy Crockett, who's a man of violence, who's killing Indians and killing bears and doing all this destruction, a lot of Cold War liberals are not really comfortable with that version of their nation's story. But Johnny Appleseed, he's the Peace Corps, you know? And so part of that becomes, and everybody loved him, and the Native Americans immediately saw him as just a good guy, and the evidence doesn't bear that out. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Kerrigan for this wonderful talk.